Welcome everybody to the final instalment of our Cry for Hope series in Lent. It's wonderful to see you all coming back again 5 weeks in, and it's been a real pleasure actually just spending this 5 weeks with you and journeying through Cry for Hope together. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel on Catch Up, you're also very welcome, and it's been great to see so many of you involved that way. My name's Charlotte Marshall. I'm one of the advocacy workers at Sabeel-Kairos UK, and I'm going to be guiding you through tonight as I have done the last 4 weeks. Tonight, we are really privileged again to be joined by 2 wonderful speakers, and we're going to be looking tonight at where is the hope in Cry for Hope. I think this is a very pertinent topic given everything that we have seen in the last sort of week to 10 days happening in Israel and Palestine. Obviously, we've had a number of attacks, some retaliations, some clashes, all resulting in quite a large loss of life on both the side of Israel and the Palestinians. And, you know, for us, that's a real heartbreak. It's a real sort of demonstration of the challenges and the situation and the tensions that are there in the region. And I'm sure our speakers tonight are going to go into this in a bit more detail, but it's really pertinent for us to think about where is the hope in this time. Just a very few brief housekeeping rules as always. Please mute yourself. If you haven't done so on entry, then if you can mute yourself now, that would be really helpful. Just helps to keep that background noise to a minimum when our speakers are speaking. Obviously, the exception to that is during our question and answer session, during which we hope you're going to have some really excellent questions. I've primed our speakers that you are an enthusiastic and knowledgeable bunch of people. So we're expecting some really good questions and comments from you. Please, if you can, during that question and answer session, please use the raise your hand function. It will just move you to the top of my screen and enable me to call on you much easier. And if you can't, then obviously, please just pop a message into me in the chat and I'll make sure I include you. So without any further comments from me, let's move on to have a look at our speakers today. And I'm really delighted that we're being joined by Shadia Qubti. And Shadia is a Christian Palestinian who was born and raised in Nazareth. And so she has Israeli citizenship. She studied international relations and English language at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and then went on to study conflict resolution and nonviolent action at Trinity College in Dublin. For the last 10 years, she served as projects manager in Musalaha, which many of you will know, an organisation that promotes reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians. She's also been involved in Christ at the Checkpoint and a number of other initiatives, which I'm sure she's going to tell you all about. And Shadia is actually joining us from Vancouver tonight. So it's her morning. So good morning, Shadia, and thank you for coming along. And we're looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us tonight. And John, our second speaker, is a very well-known name to many of you, the Reverend John Howard. John has been district chair in the Methodist Church in Britain for a long time. He was once the chair of the Joint Advisory Committee on the Ethics of Investment. He has been a volunteer in the EAPPI programme twice, because he's currently there serving in Hebron on that programme. And he was also the Methodist representative in the Jerusalem Liaison Office of the Methodist Church. He is chair of our Sabeel-Kairos Methodist group and a member of our trustees. And he's also recently published a book, Hope in Palestine and Israel, which is obviously very pertinent to our topic tonight. And that's based on his experiences of being in the region. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over first of all to Shadia, who's going to talk to us for 15 minutes, and then to John, and then we'll be obviously having our Q&A. Just a brief note to anybody who is running their own Lent group, please feel free at the end of the question and answer session to drop out of the call so that you can sort of run your own discussion group. For those of you that aren't part of one of those, please stay with us. We'll be finishing today with a brief note from our Sabeel-Kairos Chair of the Board, Karen, who's with us. And also looking at this week's action and final prayer for our series. So Shadia, when you're ready, over to you, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to be with you today and to join you as we together remember this season of Lent and maybe wrestle together with its meaning and our collective cry for hope. For the past 2 years, I've been on a learning journey in a theological studies program, learning more about the Canadian Indigenous context here in Vancouver. And so far, I can say that I'm both inspired and heartbroken to learn more about the Indigenous experience here. As a Palestinian who's engaged in peacemaking, I think, as many other Palestinians, I've reached a point where I felt that my efforts were maybe not impactful enough to see change for me. And so this learning journey is my way to regain and reshape my perspective. And this is intrinsically related to my hope for change, our theme for today. So understandably, I have this love-hate relationship with hope. Because in our pursuit for justice, it accentuates the dissonance in hope. And even in the title of the series, right, A Cry for Hope, it reflects this dissonance profoundly. While crying marks a breaking point on the one hand, hoping is this active waiting and anticipating for change. It's almost as if we need to cry to seek hope. And here we are, as we enter one of the holiest seasons for Christians as well as Jews and Muslims. Month of Ramadan just started a few days ago, and already the violence in Israel and Palestine is spiking. Lord, have mercy. And how fascinating it is that Muslims, Jews, and Christians, although for different reasons, are all fasting or denying themselves certain foods as part of their preparedness to remember and encounter their Creator. And as we reach the climax of these sacred preparations, we're experiencing further loss and collision that have recently been paralleled with religious holidays. And as someone who's lived in Jerusalem, holiday seasons are really the hardest times for Jerusalemites. More restrictions of movement, denial of entry to holy sites, heightened tensions and outbursts of violence. All of these are symptoms of systematic discrimination, where the Israeli authorities limit and control Palestinian rights to live in dignity, equality, and freedom. And I think during these times, I think we're confronted again and again with our reality of hopelessness, powerlessness, and brokenness. And I was thinking more as an observer here in Canada, looking at the war in Ukraine and Russia. You know, on the one hand, I grieve the human loss and devastation taking place right now there. There are already 4 million Ukrainian refugees that have been displaced. And this is an experience we Palestinians know too well. We also know that even though this war has been going on only for 6 weeks, its resolution is going to take much, much longer, even if a ceasefire happens tomorrow. But I'm also experiencing frustration as a Palestinian from the speed of which allies are taking actions to end Russian aggression. These same allies we have been pleading with to act similarly in our context. But furthermore, the response of neighboring countries who are welcoming and embracing Ukrainian refugees, but at the same time refusing to welcome maybe students from African countries who are fleeing the same conflict. Ukrainians are refugees, while Syrians, Iraqis, Congolese, Burkinabe, or any other non-white people are illegal foreigners. Language matters. A news outlet called this selective sympathy, which highlights that denying asylum seekers and migrants is not an issue of capacity, but an issue of willingness. We don't hear as much this rhetoric of migration crisis in this conflict. However, despite the expedient allies' responses to Russian aggression, Ukrainian people continue to be displaced and their lifestyle has been altered. And this makes me question these responses and who are they serving? Are they an attempt to stop human devastation of this war? Or are they serving other interests? The hopeful part of me wants to say both, but the hopeless part of me says maybe the latter. All the while, the disregard attention to Palestinian suffering and the corresponding international silence feeds my sense of hopelessness and powerlessness. Despite this reality, I still struggle to accept that our suffering and sense of urgency is still invisible and not heard. And maybe it's also infecting that my hope for peace in Israel and Palestine is waning. Not because I don't believe in the possibility of peace, but maybe I'm losing faith in people. Add to that the shame of admitting weakness where the church sometimes leaves little room for. So you see, hope is an existential battle. What then is hope, and why do we need it, especially in our context? And I think what's been helpful for me on this journey is to be honest, to sit with the discomfort, with this dissonance of Palestinian hopelessness and Christian hope. One of the books that I recently read entitled Following Jesus in Invaded Space, Doing Theology on Aboriginal Land. You know, the author is a white Australian male, a member of the dominant culture, who was trying to do contextual theology with a particular reference to Indigenous people and the invasion of their country. He says, hope and the capacity to set ourselves and others free begins when illusion ends. For him, illusion ended when he faced the real history and participation in structures of power and abuse. This comforts me because my disillusionment is the beginning of my hope. And one of my recent expressions to reconstruct my understanding of hope is using the term decolonizing hope, in the sense that trying to counter a theological understanding of hope. So perhaps it's helpful for me to understand my denominational background. You see, I was raised evangelical, and evangelical Christians tend to steer away from confronting our human limitations, weaknesses, and downfalls. I mean, we know they exist, but we just don't know what to do with it, so we brush over them. And some of our theology of hope confine hope to a blanket of positivity. Take, for example, our Christology and understanding of God as the victorious conqueror leaves little room for lament, for crying out, for vocalizing our experience of suffering and pain to God. I didn't grow up with Lent. In my Baptist tradition, we had Christmas and Easter, not much in between. As an adult, you know, Lent and Advent is growing on me. You know, Lent is this time to remember we are formed from dust. We remember that Jesus was a wilderness person. And we remember that in the wilderness, we find ourselves and we find God. Scripture says that Jesus and many prophets before him were voices crying in the wilderness. In Arabic, the word for wilderness means outside, al-barriyi. And wilderness represents this outside space that's unfamiliar, unknown, maybe chaotic. It causes many anxieties or uncertainties. But the wilderness is where spiritual recentering takes place. Jesus goes there just before his suffering on the cross. Right? He's on his own mission quest with Creator. And as Christians, we know that with the suffering comes resurrection. In fact, the authors of the Gospels also knew that, and they wrote the Gospels with the resurrection in mind throughout Jesus's ministry. This is a critical vantage point. The place of suffering, pain, weakness, powerlessness is the same place where the resurrection happened, this restored hope. And maybe I'm still in my own wilderness where I'm confronting my own weaknesses, my own pain, at the same time seeking out God's hope. And I'm just going to share 3 things that I'm kind of contemplating, especially around hope from this journey. You know, while reality gives us a sense of what is happening, hope gives us a sense of potentiality, what could be. Jürgen Moltmann, his famous book, Ethics of Hope, says that hope is when we want what is now impossible, that we arrive to the limits of our possibilities. See, when we cannot see what is possible, when peace seems impossible, God's hope, this potentiality, opens our eyes to his kingdom. When there is brokenness, hope enables us to imagine restoration. Just the resurrection of the Messiah as a man resurrected from the dead is impossible for many to believe, but for people of faith, this is the beginning of our renewed hope. And when we hope, we're also waiting, anticipating of what is to come. This awakening of hope carries the promised future of peace and justice into life. The promise of God's coming unfolds a transforming power of the present. So while we hope, while we actively expect, we are prepared for God's future, and that future gains power in our present. We pray, thy will be done on earth as in heaven. So when we pray for the Lord's Prayer, we awaken this promise. In other words, this waiting means not conforming to the conditions of this world of injustice and violence. People who expect God's justice and righteousness no longer accept facts on the ground because they know that a better world is possible, where changes in the present are necessary. We don't give up, not before the structures of power of this world and not before one's own helplessness, but living with our heads held high. This reminds me of the Palestinian word we use, sumud, right? Translate as perseverance. And I think as Palestinian Christians, we're engaging in peace because we know a better world is possible. Being agents of change is part of our faith, and that takes many forms, be it advocacy, civic participation, nonviolent protest, because our ability to imagine peace on earth. And I feel like I'm carrying on this ancestral journey, committing our lives and efforts to face the real history and participation of the structures of power and abuse. I want to read a poem by an Indigenous poet, David Groulx, Indigenous Canadian, who wrote several poems to Palestinians in a little book titled From Turtle Island to Gaza. He says, "Name your oppressors, Ibrahim. Create a space with your words and whisper it to me. And we can share it, and in this space, together create hope. The sound of the name creates hope. Hope that begins breaking the first word like dawn." The poem resonates with me because it echoes the power of solidarity and the hope it creates. Change is happening. And we've seen that. Some news outlets are also breaking the narrative, the dominant narrative of events. Solidarity breeds hope. It brings us closer to where we need to be. And God's hope moves us to bring justice and peace into this world based on what God has revealed to us. Because when we achieve some justice to those who are suffering violence, then God's future shines into their world. When we take up the cause of the marginalized, strangers, and creation, a fragment of life comes into our own life. So whether it's perceiving possibility or actively waiting and anticipating and not conforming to the conditions of this world and not giving up, it means resisting the structures of power of this world and dreaming boldly as God's children where peace is possible. This is part of our story of restoration. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shadia. And gosh, how insightful. I don't even know where to start on that, sort of summarizing that really, but I'm looking forward to the questions. I just think that wonderful kind of view you've got, particularly from obviously working with Indigenous communities, you know, the intersectionality of all of that and how that plays into providing hope is brilliant. So yeah, let's hope that we get some really interesting questions around that. And thank you for your presentation. And John, over to you. You've got 15 minutes as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Charlotte, and greetings to you all from Hebron. When Shadia sent her what she was going to be saying to me in the week, I was fascinated what a contrast it makes with what I'd felt I would want to say here from Hebron. Because in a sense, I want to talk about, but in the context of a place where sometimes the last thing you feel is any sense of hope. And yet we're in Lent. And Lent is the time when we reflect upon the suffering, the pain. The darkest hour of the Garden of Gethsemane is that short time before the resurrection. And I'm frequently reminding others, and others have reminded me, that when the bridges came in Northern Ireland as a result of the Good Friday Agreement, and when the Berlin Wall came down, very few of us predicted it more than a few weeks beforehand. These major changes seem to be very difficult to identify in the future. The darkest hour is often, it seems, just before dawn. I was here in the West Bank 2 years ago, just before the COVID crisis. And coming back now, the extent to which the infrastructure of the settlements has grown is phenomenal. As you drive from Jerusalem towards Hebron, Route 6 is being built. It's being built as far as Kiryat Arba, not beyond. For very good reason. It's being built to connect all of those settlements in the Gazetchion group and the ones around Hebron with Jerusalem. When you go into any of the settlements, you immediately see the huge amount of building. I don't think most people in Britain can imagine the amount of building that goes on here. You don't see it in Britain, the extent of the building, even in areas where we think we're doing a lot of building development. And even in the center of Hebron, which is thought to be the major Palestinian industrial city, the development, the growth, the expansion, the building of those settlements in the center of Hebron is now beginning to dominate Shadia Street. Shadia Street looks totally different to what it did 2 years ago. And then, as we arrived in Hebron, we experienced the tragic situation of Palestinian on Palestinian violence. It's not something which has been talked about very much, but it was taking place to a considerable degree in Hebron at the time. It was as a result of a particular dispute between two families. But the context of the occupation was undoubtedly a feature as well. Internationals who are involved in telling the world what's happening here are experiencing how increased the targeting is upon us. A new system known as Blue Wolf facial recognition is making life very difficult for us. The banning of the 6 human rights organizations, Palestinian human rights organizations, is a further demonstration of the extent to which Israel is now actively hiding the activity that it has here within the West Bank. And then we begin to think about what Charlotte has already mentioned, the upsurge in violence in the last few days. Only a short distance from here, day before yesterday, a young Palestinian man was shot by the Israeli authorities. One of the increasing number of fatalities that are happening across Israel and the West Bank, tragically at present, on both sides, in Palestinian and Israeli homes. The grieving is growing once again. It is pretty dark here. And therefore, remembering that this is Lent and Easter is around the corner, remembering that the darkest hour is just before dawn, is something that is important to do. Back, I and other members of the team here in Hebron visited the village of Al Ganut. It's a few miles outside of Hebron in Area C. The village suffers from demolitions and settlements, and recently the sheikh of the village was attacked. He's called Abu Jamal. And while we were talking, he was moving his hand, and his hand was bandaged fully because he'd been stabbed. And in defending himself from stabbings, his hand had been very viciously damaged. But as so many of these elders of these villages are able, he spoke with a wisdom and a gravity that was inspirational. And after talking about passages from the Quran and quoting from Christian and Jewish scriptures as well, he used the phrase which I've kept in mind ever since, and that was, a nation without compassion is a nation without a future. And he looked at the collapse of a number of different empires and states and identified the lack of compassion as a common factor in these things. He, of course, was saying and making clear his perception of Israel as a society without compassion. In my book that Charlotte mentioned a few moments ago, which I entitled Hope in Israel Palestine, I attempt to outline why it is that real hope for justice and peace in the land called holy, in all of the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the River Jordan, is something that is realistic. We have to remember that what has been created in this state of Israel today seems so different to the vision of so many who came. You'll remember that the Qubti had as an ethos a very socialist type of vision, very different to the right-wing politics of Israel today. And amidst the terrible situations that I've outlined already and witnessed myself while being here in the West Bank again over the last 3 months, I've also been reminded of what I've seen before and again tried to describe in the book that I wrote, a number of inspirational people and organizations that are here doing tremendous work. I mean, Shadia, as you know, has worked for a long time with Musalaha, and I've a great deal of respect for that organization. Its work is bringing people together. It is changing people's perceptions, and it is working at those foundations that ultimately are needed if we are to create a nation of peace and justice, or rather, it's not us that's going to create that, but if the people of Israel Palestine are going to create that nation of peace, justice, and compassion, then that type of work that Musalaha does in bringing people together is precisely what is needed. As is, for example, the work of the hand-in-hand schools. Growing Israel, I understand that now 4 times of pupils are trying to get places in the hand-in-hand schools as there are places available. And the hand-in-hand schools, which if you don't know about them, they two teachers are made up less equally of Jewish children. The school sees as its mission, of schools rather, because there are, I believe now 8 of them, as their mission, not only to educate the children, but also through the children to educate the parents and the grandparents, and therefore to have a wider impact of Israeli society than simply the people of that school. When I visited the one in Tapiot, as part of Jerusalem, we happened to call it a coffee shop nearby. And when we bought our cup of coffee and while we were there, we said we were going to the school. And immediately the people running the coffee shop said, "Oh, you're going to our school. It's a wonderful school." They didn't have children there, but they knew about the work that was going on. Or Tent of Nations, I was there on Wednesday. And once again, we've got visitors coming to the Tent of Nations. Daoud and Daher, who've been sadly attacked only in January, are continuing the work which they do. With the same commitment, we refuse to be enemies. And the inspiration of that farm is once again spreading to different people as they visit, and I think as people hear a work that they are doing. I could continue with many other organisations, but let me just mention WEAM, because we've already had Zugbi speaking in this series already. WEAM, conflict resolution within the Palestinian community, doing work that needs to be done. I've mentioned already the Palestinian violence that is plaguing the West Bank at present, but also as a place of hospitality right in the very shadow of the wall, where people can come and see the situation and be received and help to understand what it is that they see. We believe, as a community in Sabeel-Kairos, and I think amongst those who are in Lent course, in the means of change that is described as non-violent. We see that as being the ethical way to bring about a better world. But I do sense a certain lacking, no, maybe diminishing of hope that is around, even amongst the internationals who are committed to Israel and Palestine. People saying to me things like, well, I'm not sure I'm ever going to see it in my own lifetime. It may be true, but the hope to be able to see it, the hope maintained, seems to me to be one of the most vital elements in any non-violent campaign. If we don't believe we can change it, then what's the chance of us changing it? Cry for Hope is just that. It's to the world from the Christian community of the land called Holy for hope. Shadia mentioned Samud, the steadfastness of Palestinians. And quite honestly, if you go into H2, like I do every day, and see the conditions under which Palestinians are having to live, and yet they stay there, determined that they are not going to be shifted from that environment that they own, that is their place, that is their home, because of incursions of the settlers. If you see that Samud,
oh, we were doing so well. I thought we'd managed to get through the whole thing without losing John. Just bear with me for a second. I'm going to see if he comes back. Ah, John, we lost you.
Oh dear.
It's
Sorry.
okay. We got to. If you see that Samud and then you froze. So take it from there, please.
Okay. So if you see that Samud, then it is inspirational. It's something that it's right to support. And indeed, to be able to identify with. Perhaps the best way that we can support that hope among those who need to Samud is the invitation to come, see, go, tell. Time and again, I'm told how inspirational folk find it. This afternoon, I was visiting a wonderful Palestinian family. The father died, sadly, at checkpoint 56 in Hebron. And they remain in the home that they've lived in for many, many years. And they spoke about how much they value internationals coming and simply seeing the situation and knowing that they go and tell. But we need hope too. And I hope myself that the type of things I've been talking about are things that inspire our hope as internationals so that we can sustain that hope through the campaigns. One phrase that I often hear in Palestine is that justice and peace will come, inshallah, in God's time. I always want to say, yes, but even God has the right to expect a little help from us. I hope that this course and the various conversations around it, the speeches we've heard, have inspired us to think about what actions we each individually can take. I hope that this course has given reasons for hope, given some examples of hope, and inspired some hope in each and every one of us taking part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. What a brilliant way to end our series. And I think it's absolutely true that it has inspired some hope because of all the feedback that we've been getting about it, and the positive way that people have spoken about the topics we've addressed, and the way that people have been able to hear from so many different speakers on so many different of the themes that come up in Cry for Hope. So it's really brilliant. And can I ask you, just in the next sort of 20 seconds, whilst I briefly address our wonderful YouTube watchers, if you've got a question, please raise your hand, and then I can call on you. I know there's a couple in the chat box as well, but it would be great if we can get a good number of questions coming to Shadia and John, and use the experience that they've got and the on-the-ground reality that they've referenced in their talks. If you have been watching us on YouTube, thank you very much for joining us for this final part. We hope you have a wonderful discussion in your groups, and obviously the opportunity to use this material outside of Lent is there as well. So this will be up on our site for a little while, but we will say goodbye to you for now and thank you.